Connaissance, recherche,
sciences,
sciences,
mathématiques,
théorie,
physique,
philosophie,
conférences,
archéologie,
nature.
So what if I were to tell you that everything you've heard in the last 2 days is false? That you've just been put up, and you've spent the last 48 hours hearing a lot of things which are not true. Well, that would be a pretty shocking revelation, wouldn't it? But in fact, that's exactly what has happened to the economic development profession. They're being told that a lot of the things they thought were true, or a lot of the things they thought they had proof for, they have none. They're not very happy. I think for the last 60 years, we have missed an opportunity. The opportunity to systematically learn what works and what doesn't through the application of rigorous scientific methods. That is not to say that no scientific methods were used, but that the systematic use of these methods to learn from our success and failures were not in place. Now, the good news, I think, is that it is the time now for economic development to do what other science have done, which is to incorporate scientific methods as part and parcel of its work. And of course, we are painfully aware of how little we know and how much we have in front of us to do. So you've heard these last 2 days examples of what we are learning. And that's really the tip of the iceberg. Now, I think the first thing we need to do is to keep an open mind, because many of the things that we thought were true, as I said, may be proven wrong. And so we'll need to be open enough to allow this new evidence to come in and create the structures for us to be able to incorporate the new knowledge as it becomes available. This is a story I really like, because it's a story of personal success and institutional failure. In 1909, Elizabeth Kenny was a nurse, not a very well-trained nurse, but a nurse who ended up in the Australian bush. And she was confronted with a child who was suffering from polio and was in the midst of spasm. So she contacted a doctor in the next town, and she got a telex back saying, "No known cure. Treat symptoms." And so she did. And now, because she was untrained in polio, she did not follow the practice of that time, which was to immobilize children suffering from spasms. Instead, she used her own common sense and applied heat to the legs of these children to stop them, to stop the muscles from having spasms. And after the muscles calmed down, she engaged these children in serious rehabilitation. Now, of course, this was momentous, because the 6 children that she treated in 1909 all walked. And this was revolutionary for that time. No children almost walked after a bad incidence of polio. But what she found from the profession was ridicule, mocking. She was accused of not having diagnosed those children correctly, that it was impossible. And it took 32 years of fighting before the National Foundation of Infantile Paralysis actually adopted her therapy as the rule. Now, of course, you say, oh, but that's, beginning of last century, the Australian bush. Well, I think this is an example that everybody knows. Again, from the medical profession. In the early 80s, 2 medical interns discovered that ulcers were caused by bacterial infection. In 1984, one of these interns poisoned himself because nobody believed him. So he poisoned himself. He drank a concoction of bacteria to prove that he would get an ulcer, and also that it could be cured with antibiotics. It took another 10 years for NIH to adopt antibiotic treatment for ulcers. So now these are examples from the medical field where, by any measures, science has been the rule. Now, the question for economic development is, can we do any better? Or how can we make sure that what we discover actually gets implemented as part of our policies? So we have not started this yesterday. And I think we have started accumulating quite a bit of knowledge on how to do this in a way that it makes sense for practitioners. And we have heard some very interesting cases in the last 2 days of how the work of researchers can go hand in hand with the work of practitioners, and in fact responds to the priorities of those practitioners. We have also heard that a transition from the old way of using impact evaluation, which was used really as an auditing tool, at the end of a process, telling people, Dow has done well or Dow has not done well. And that was, and that's something we still do, but that's something that certainly doesn't gain much sympathy from practitioners. Because you're there, you're an external evaluator, you come and you judge what other people are doing, usually with limited knowledge about their own programs. What practitioners do like and respond to is helping them use impact evaluation, rigorous tools, to take management decisions. Management decisions not to measure what they do, but to know how to improve what they do. This is a fundamental difference. And I think we have seen this profession move very quickly from the auditing function to the management tool function. And that's really the future of the science. We've also seen a transition away from experiments outside the prevailing institutional mechanisms in a country into working within those institutional mechanisms to make sure that the people who have to take decisions, or that the evaluation is done on the institutional mechanisms on which the decision makers are acting. I found this nice quote. I hope you like it with me. It says, "Profit comes from what is there, usefulness comes from what is not there." It's a Chinese philosopher, Lao Tzu. And I thought, oh, well, that fits my case. Because I think in a little bit, this is what we as researchers, well, or they as researchers and we as researchers, I am really at the crossroad of both, can do, which is to provide the framework, the analytical framework, but leave enough space, empty space within that, for practitioners to fill in their own questions. And then together, go about figuring out what is useful to the practitioners and what will make a difference in our programs. Now, I've heard some people say, oh yes, I've asked the practitioners, but they don't know what they want. Oh, I've heard this many times. And so the issue here is that finding out what we need to learn as practitioners takes time, takes knowledge, capacity, critical thinking. It is an engaged process of discussion. People don't just know the answer to the question, what it is you want to learn, off the cuff. But the process of discussing how programs are implemented, what are the options out there, what are the alternatives we are considering, why we are considering those alternatives, what do we know from prior experience, et cetera, et cetera. That process is a process that generates a lot of interesting and deeply relevant questions. And I do think, as I say at the end, that people are not really interested in the answer to a question they have not asked themselves. And so by facilitating this process of asking questions, the answers become much more relevant and much more interesting to the people for which those answers are to become useful. Now, my second point in terms of, learning how to get our programs to be better, as opposed to only measuring what they deliver. I have an example from Ethiopia with which we have been engaged for a few years now. Initially, as we were negotiating a project, the first electricity project with the government of Ethiopia, the question was, how much will rural electrification do for us, or do for the people in the rural towns? And that, of course, is an important question. We want to know whether, what is the return to our investment? But then very quickly, when we were negotiating this project with the Minister of Energy, the minister had a very important question to put on the table. And the question was, how will I make sure that enough people connect so that I can meet the targets the Ministry of Finance put on me? And so then we agreed that we would run some experiments on the connection cost. And in this case, we ran town lotteries with discount coupons for connection rates to electricity. And through that process, the government found out that to meet the type of targets they had put out there, they actually needed a small subsidy. They were also interested, and here I connect back to some of the things that Pascaline was saying regarding the prices that one should charge. We had the whole discussion about energy-efficient light bulbs. Energy-efficient light bulbs cut the cost of electricity per poor household to 1/3. And so they're not only good for to keep demands on generation capacity low, but they're also good for the people. And so there too, we started experimenting with different prices for these light bulbs that at that time were extraordinarily expensive. They were $5 per light bulb, which of course no Ethiopian could afford. Now, it so happened that there was a big crisis and generation capacity was very constrained. The government had to decide whether to go and lease generators to meet the capacity increases, and instead they found a much cheaper way of lowering demands on its generation capacity. They just bought 4.5 million light bulbs and distributed to everyone. So that experiment went out of the door. But what we need to know now, and what we are discussing with them now, is how to create a system of collection and disposal of these light bulbs, because these light bulbs contain gas mercury, which can be dangerous, and how to establish the private supply chain for the replacement of these light bulbs, which, by the way, now the prices of these light bulbs have fallen to about 50 to 80 cents per light bulb since they become widely utilized in the developing world. And the third point, about people learning through their own experience. Again, the importance of embedding our work very much within the institutional framework of the people who will take the decisions, for at least two reasons. First is the validity of our results for the programs that are taking decisions. But second, something that you have heard from your father probably many times in your life, or at least when you were young, I know better. I know you have to learn through your own experience, right? And it usually gets parents a little uneasy, but we all know that people only learn really through their own experience. Here I want to add a fourth point, which is a point that has been raised, I think, which is that there is generation of knowledge which is outside each program or each policymaker's direct experience. And the question is, how do we bring those lessons back to the rest of the world? And so we need to think really hard on how to create those networks of information to make the information relevant and available. Not necessarily applicable. We must remember it's not necessarily applicable, but it opens windows and possibilities and considerations from the rest of the world. So here is my 100-mile run, which was mentioned earlier. And some people, I think, I'm totally insane. But my vision is to bring to every implementing agency in the world enough capacity, enough awareness, that they will consider implementing their programs in slightly different ways. Every government I've ever worked with makes decisions, makes changes to their program every year. And the question is, can we structure those changes in our programs so that they're not just blanket changes, but they're structured in a way that allow us to see whether the new ways of doing things are better than the old, and then take a decision whether the new ways should be scaled up or not. I have to say, I was very pleased just last week, because in December, we had a workshop in Dakar, and one of the country delegations that participated in this workshop was the National HIV/AIDS Control Program from Senegal. They came and they told us, well, they got our usual training about impact evaluation and a clinic discussion about how they could evaluate what they wanted to evaluate. And they basically told us in December, this was mid-December, and of course there was Christmas after, that in early January, they were rolling out their new program called post-test clubs. These are clubs for people who take HIV tests in clinics and then are directed towards clubs to receive additional information and motivation and attention as to attempt to change their sexual behavior. My initial recommendation to them, my initial recommendation was that the only way to evaluate this new intervention was to actually randomly assign this intervention to some community-based organization and not to some others. At the same time, we had no time to do a baseline. The thing was going out in January. So my best recommendation to them was, honestly, to change what they wanted to evaluate. Now, it so happened that the Senegalese government totally surprised me, because with the speed of light, they decided that they will randomize the phase-in of the intervention, and actually created 2 separate treatment groups and a control group, and we're going out in July to collect data and help them figure out whether their new idea, the post-test clubs, is worth its while. Now, why am I mentioning this example? The reason I mention this example is because this has little to do about evaluation. In a fundamental way, it has to do with how you think about your programs, not about how you think about evaluation. Evaluation is the tool that we use to then inform this process. But the most important thing that we want to affect is the process of planning and implementing programs. And so when I said this is my 100-mile, it's because I don't expect that we might have the resources to cover every single program in every single country, in every single ministry, in every single case. But I do expect that we move towards having much greater awareness from program managers, from policymakers, on how you affect your programs over time, and how you can use even non-expensive tools to look at whether you're doing better or not. We have pushed governments for years now to set up monitoring evaluation system, administrative systems, and this is all very good. These systems are needed. In Europe, there's no question that systems are there. But in many of the countries we work with, there are no systems, there is no monitoring, there is no administrative data. Now, the point of evaluation, the rigorous evaluation, is not the surveys, but it's the structuring of the intervention so that you can draw lessons out. And you can use whatever data you have at your disposal. Some will be better than some other. But the structuring, the analytical structuring, is what will make the difference between your ability to tell. And so I expect us to be able to reach all these implementing agencies and make them understand how they can do this, even on their own. So as Esther kindly said, I'm at the head of the bank-wide impact evaluation initiative. And we set ourselves 3 goals. One, it's of course to generate knowledge. But this is not where we want to stop. Really what we want to do is use what we have, what the World Bank has, which is an amazing network of operations in relationship with governments. Not to reproduce those networks, but to work through that network, the network that is already in place, and use our own operations and our own influence to use those operations as a tool of learning, not just to deliver something, not just to deliver an intervention, but actually learn and demonstrate what might work. And of course, because we work with governments mainly, and through government systems, what we do is a sample of what the whole government does. It's just part of the financing into the bigger machinery of government. And then work with those governments to help them develop the institutions that are needed. And we have heard a lot of practitioners in the last 2 weeks that have incorporated a certain way of thinking about their own programs. This is what we want to do with government institutions, incorporate that kind of thinking. So I call this a new business model. And certainly for the bank, it is a new business model. We are considering a big reform in our investment lending, and we are working with the team working on that investment lending to see how we change the very nature of our operations. As I said again, not to just deliver an intervention, but to learn from those interventions. And what that means for colleagues at the bank who are really the practitioners, because you're not really looking at the practitioner right here. The people who are in the regions are actually doing operations. The same cultural shift that we are expecting from government, we're expecting from them. People say to me, do you expect to tell my counterpart that I don't know what I'm doing? And I said, well, perhaps, but that we'll work towards finding out. That's a difficult thing to. But I think for the bank, it's a very good exercise in humility, at the minimum. So we have a programmatic approach. And I'm going to go quickly through the steps, because we use words, but then words mean nothing. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the process for you to understand what a programmatic approach looks like. For me, a programmatic approach means that I need to find partners. And the partners are from the people who actually implement, design, and supervise actual interventions. So I partner up with so-called sector managers who work in the regions. They work through their own task teams and through a series of discussions with governments to identify projects that are in preparation that would work within our program. We target one type of institution at a time, such as ministries of education, Ministry of Health, national HIV control, etc. And then we work, and once the government say, yes, I'm interested, I want to participate, then we ask them to constitute government teams. And the minimum government team that we require is a policymaker, a program manager, and a statistician M&E type. Because what we need is power to decide, knowledge about the program, and some follow-up capacity. And then we take all these countries to a common venue, which we call the launch of our workshop. And the purpose of these workshops is to create informed consumers of impact evaluation. Evaluation means many different things. So somebody yesterday asked the question, hasn't the World Bank done evaluation since forever? And I said, sure, we've done evaluation since forever, but the type of evaluation that from a scientific point of view has little validity. It's evaluation that was evaluation, or is still done in fact, that it's very process-oriented and looks at outcomes, but kind of before and after. No counterfactual, no control groups. So if the economy does well, we do well. If there is a famine, we don't do so well. Well, that's not very comforting. And certainly it's not a very good way of thinking about whether a program is delivering on its promises. So the purpose of these workshops, as I said, is to train these delegations, these government delegations. They train us, really. There's a two-way stream of information. They tell us what they're doing, how they're doing it. We tell them how the tools can be helpful to them. And then we have a lot of discussions about what the evidence out there says. You have had a little snapshot, right, in the last 2 days from various areas. So we'll take one area, the areas that is relevant to our client, to that specific client, and go through all what we know about malaria interventions. Again, it is not to say that this will be relevant to them, perhaps, but it certainly kind of will open some windows. Now, after the training and the sharing of experiences, we go through 2 days of clinics. The clinics are all facilitated, so for every delegation will come an impact evaluation specialist and the person from the World Bank who's in charge of that sector in that country. Because, surprise, surprise, we're not sector specialists. We're economists, and we can work with sector specialists to structure the interventions and the evaluations, but we are not the authority on that sector. So we work as partners with the governments, and together we run this process of discovery or of setting a learning agenda. The whole idea is to do this process bottom up. As I said, we have an opportunity to kind of put things on the table, but governments set their own agenda. And we try to understand how best to help them evaluate that agenda. And so then we work through these 2 days so that each government goes out with a concept note. Then they go home, discuss it internally, and when they're ready, we go to the country and start working with them to set it up. One of the most recent experience was in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia last April. We had 26 country delegations from agricultural ministries and from community development programs. And a couple of weeks ago, the first team started going out to the countries to follow up on the designs of these evaluations. Just in terms of the financing of it, governments shoulder most of the cost. They pay, of course, perhaps through bank financing, but it's still their money. They pay for the intervention as well as for data collection. What we try to do from our side is to raise all the money that will be required to provide the analytical services to them. I think I made this point before, but just to say that by putting us at the service of our own operations and at the service of the programs of the government, we have an opportunity to change those processes in fundamental ways. We are not just doing the evaluation. As we work with project team during preparation, we're actually changing the very nature of those operations. So the way I got to this job wasn't free of charge. I worked in the Africa region, and when I got to the Africa region of the World Bank, the Africa region was dead last on impact evaluation in the bank. I did a stock taking and discovered that the bank had done 2 evaluations per year in the previous 10 years. And this was the result, really, of 2 people doing, good work. Now, the way I got to my present job is that starting from where we were in 2005, by 2008, the Africa region was not only the leader in the bank, but by such a spread that it was undeniable that governments had reacted to the approach. Again, nobody likes to be judged, but everybody likes to have their own questions answered and their own program to get better. So this is just a little pictures of where Africa went and why today our managing director agrees that we should try to do the same for all the other regions in the bank. The last one is Africa with 101 ongoing evaluations, and the next one is Latin America. And I want to point out here that these are World Bank impact evaluations, right? It doesn't mean that the countries in Latin America are doing less than the countries in Africa. It just says that what the World Bank is supporting and doing together with those countries. So moving forward, we have agreed on about 20 thematic programs. About a dozen of these are under implementation, even though not all of them have the kind of structure, the kind of thinking that I put on the table. And the others we've agreed to develop in the next couple of years. The programs try to focus on some of the big questions we think will be relevant in development across many sectors. And here are just some headlines, but everyone has some focus areas within. Of course, we have a whole new area in private sector with 3 separate programs. Education, health, social protection, governance issues, and climate change adaptation, which is also fully new, access to services and markets, and then the gender area, but which is really kind of incorporated within some of the other programs. The way we organize our programs is by having a coordinating unit with a lead impact evaluation specialist and a lead sector specialist and somebody who coordinates full-time. This coordinator is not an administrator. It's more like, a junior PhD economist who will run about and make sure that all the countries in the programs are doing well and perhaps take the leadership in a couple of cases. A technical advisory group, which is the sum total of all the researchers and specialists that are required to think about what the work would be in all the countries. We have experience I think in the World Bank that some countries get better advice than some others for various reasons. In some cases, it's just because the officials are better trained and they require better services. In others, because countries may be poorer or smaller, and there is not equal advice across the board. So this is a way that we think we can actually provide same advice, good or bad, hopefully good, across several countries that are part of these programs. But also take the opportunity to have some level of harmonization across countries so that when it comes down to it, when the results come in, we are actually able to do a little bit of comparing across. And this setup supports each impact evaluation at the country level. The teams at the country level are inclusive of the government, they're inclusive of our operations staff, as well as the research team. Okay. So let me just say that I think we've covered kind of the program activities, which are really a series of activities to build capacity within governments, to create communities of practice across governments to share experiences and evidence, and also this kind of technical advisory group to help with quality assurance and knowledge sharing. But then the in-country activities, I think you had a taste of it from the presentations. The setups are not so different. But basically what we do in country is to establish these teams that include the practitioners and the researchers working very closely together. And of course, we help and support the whole process of design, data collection, data analysis. We also even supply over-monitor these programs to make sure that they're implemented in the way that it was agreed. This is very important for the evaluations, otherwise we evaluate something that did not happen. And of course, also a lot of training of the national teams. And this is the final picture, just to tell you a little bit of what goes on through these 20 programmatic areas. You see numbers. So some of these areas are really programmatic in the way that I've described. Some are more piecemeal. They have not been organized yet, that there is not a kind of overall thinking about them. So at the bottom, you have things that are happening in private sector and finance, which are mostly our partner institution, the IFC, which works for the private sector evaluations, and they're mostly contracted out, kind of more older style. You go and figure out whether a program worked. The blue ones are everything that is happening in human development sectors, such as health, education, and social protection. On the governance, the big red line are evaluations in local governance program. And our governance program, particular, is not started yet, so has a nice 0 to it. And in green, everything that has to do with climate change and infrastructure. Oops. So thank you very much.
I guess a couple of days ago, or maybe yesterday, Esther and I were talking, and we were saying that, I mean, we feel like we must be cheating someone because, we get to do this work which we love and enjoy. We at least flatter ourselves that we are useful. We get to work with all these wonderful organizations like SNS, Pratham, Elamana on one side, and AFD, World Bank, Hewlett Foundation, and many others on the other side, and with all these wonderfully gifted people, and then we even get paid for it. And it seems like a miracle, but I feel very grateful, I must say. So what I wanted to do was, in a sense, entirely, I mean, this was, I sort of assumed that this was what Arianna would do, to talk about sort of the practicalities and the usages in the policy world of this methodology of randomized evaluations. I thought I would take an opportunity to therefore not say anything about, in a sense, the direct policy questions, though as you see, along the way, policy questions always come up, but rather go to, but endorse everything she said, and then go on to the other side of the methodology, which is to talk about research. And partly, I think this is clearly my comparative advantage relative to Arianna, given that she knows a lot more about how the world of practice works. But also because I feel that in a sense there is actually something which is worth saying in this context of even in this context of discussion of useful things we can do. It's worth underscoring the fact that we are in this partly to learn the answer to questions of immediate relevance to a specific policy question, but also in part to answer questions which are of a more I don't know, I don't want to use the word fundamental, but more basic kind. Again, I don't like that word either, but questions of the kind which sort of allow us to have some handle on, if we had to. We are often, as policy people who are sometimes involved in policy discourses, and when talking to policymakers, there is always this, if you like, slightly awkward point where people say, well, but how do you know that this one is worth doing a randomized evaluation on? And at that point, you sort of scratch your head and you go back to something which is clearly not directly informed. So the choice of what you evaluate is clearly something that doesn't come from another evaluation, or may come from another evaluation, but often does not and cannot, because the first time you do it, how would you know what to evaluate? And so there is always this other world, if you like, the world of economics, or economics plus broader social scientific theory, which lives around the world of the experiments, but we always refer back to it, sometimes guiltily, because we know that some of that is based on non-experimental evidence. We feel uncomfortable, but there is all that other the world around which we have to refer to, and in a sense which we have to leverage, because there is no other way to come to some common sense about where do you go next. Now, one of the things that has been exciting, therefore, is that in a sense, I think over time, I think we have been put in a position of feeling less guilty. In other words, partly, I think one of the things that randomized evaluations have helped us do is they've helped us think better about what the question we should be asking. In some sense, and that's in a sense the sense in which it has informed research. So it has informed the way we start asking questions. And that's a function that's very important, because obviously we can't, even with all the energy that Arianna brings to it, we're not going to evaluate everything in the world. We're going to evaluate some things which make sense for one reason or another. Often we rely on the fact that somebody like Rukmini knows what's sensible, and we just ask her and she tells us this is sensible, and you evaluate it. That end of story. But sometimes even Rukmini may not always know the answer. She will forgive me for saying this. So there's a sense in which we need to also build a knowledge base which informs what questions to ask. And it's that sense of research which I wanted to sort of go to take this, what I wanted to do in my last, 15 minutes now, is to bring us a bit back to that question, which is how does the methodology of randomized trials, how does that inform sort of research, not necessarily always research about sort of policy research, but really research about social scientific research more generally. So let me start with where we were, and I'm old enough to remember the time, like in the mid-90s, when if you didn't want to use the word randomized evaluation, because if you ever used it, you would get the equivalent of the article that Orazio mentioned, which is, are you playing games with the lives of people? And so we wanted to invent various euphemisms to avoid saying the word randomized, and there was all kinds of word games we were playing with to hide the fact that all we wanted to do really is randomized. And from there we've come a long way. We can talk about it openly. We're out of the closet, and that's all good. At that time, the reason why we were fighting for it was actually because we, I think correctly, assessed that this was a better way to answer the existing policy questions people were asking. So they were asking a set of questions. We were doing some statistical, clever statistical things to try to answer them. And then it was also But it was clear at some level that if we could only run some experiments, we would be able to answer those same policy questions much better. The answers would be more transparent, the answers would be much simpler, people would need to know many books of statistics to understand the answers. So we wanted it as a tool to give reliable estimates to policy questions. I think what has happened over the last, I would say 15 years now almost, is that the randomized experiments have now evolved into something much larger, even within the research community. They are now not only tools for evaluating policy questions, but for promoting research and understanding a broader general understanding of the world. So in particular, randomized trials have changed the way we do economics, I think, in 4 ways. One, it has, I think, changed the nature of measurement that's used in economics. Second, it's changed the set of questions we ask. Third, in sort of policy questions we ask. Fourth, this is related, it helped us refine our questions. And finally, it's helped us go back to the theories that we started from and challenge them. And you've seen examples of this all day today, so it's not that I'm saying something that's particularly different or original, but I think it's worth underscoring each of these with an example. So what I'm going to do, since this is a conference in honor of Esther, and she didn't take the opportunity to speak or speak much, I decided that I'm going to pick examples from her work to illustrate each of these points. So let me do that. So one of the big advantages of doing randomized trials, which is, I think, very important, and I think only over time did we appreciate it. So in a sense, it's one of these things you learn on the fly, but once you learn it, you realize how powerful that is that you know who's treated. I mean, not always when you have what are called encouragement designs, where you encourage people to take up something, less so. But mostly when you look at non-experimental evaluations, what you end up doing is you say, well, there was a change in policy here that caused some schools in this area, we don't know which ones, some of them got extra textbooks, and then maybe some of those schools use those textbooks for some children, and then we're going to be compare, so the average child in this area versus the average child in this other area, without knowing exactly who was affected. And that means that when you have to collect data, if you wanted to get detailed data, you have to collect data on every child, or at least on a sample from a very large population. By knowing, one of the advantages of experimental methods is that you know who you treated. Often not exactly, but you have a pretty good guess that somebody has a 70% or 40% or 60% chance of being treated. That changes your costs of measurement, because you now know that if I wanted to do very sophisticated, detailed measurement, I would know who to go and measure. Whereas if I were doing this on a very large data set using statistical methods, I wouldn't actually know who is actually affected. I will sort of take a guess that somebody must be, and I'm going to just sort of use the average of everybody to. Moreover, this is somewhat related, which is that when you do, you also, when you have these large statistical, non-experimental studies, you also, and even if this is all assuming that they don't have the usual sort of bias problems that we were trying to solve originally, let's say they generate, reliable estimates, we also worry about the fact that precisely because we are now taking advantage of a policy that was implemented by somebody who had no intention of making this implementation a tool for evaluation. We also worry about the fact that, when you implemented it, you not only implemented this, but you implemented many other things together. So in some sense, what we get from a randomization, and this is the point I come back to, is the fact that I know who was affected by which treatment. And not just that many people were affected by many treatments, which is the usual statistical problem that we deal with. given that we know we can measure. And that means that we can do much more high-quality measurement on a much smaller set of people. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an experiment that Esther and Raghav Chattopadhyay, Rohini, and others were involved with. It's an experiment where in India, where 1/3 of local government heads are by law required to be women, and that is the government conveniently does a randomization to choose which places have women heads and which don't. So we didn't have to persuade anybody. The government, in the interest of fairness, implemented this. This rotates over time. Does this change the perception of women leaders? Well, how do you measure perception? And you go ask people, do you hate women? Most people don't say yes. So you have to figure out a way to get around that problem. That's a problem which getting reliable data on the question of, do you like women leaders? Do you like, what's your evaluation of women leaders? Is quite a difficult task. Now, the two basic methodologies that they implement, each of which is very rare or essentially the first one, the IATs, the implicit association tests, I think this was the first, really sort of systematic use of them in economics. These are tests where you have people try to match words with attributes. And so what you're looking at is there's some words which are naturally associated with women and some other words which they naturally associate with men. When you give them words that are naturally associated, they associate them faster. And so you measure the speed of association. Now, this is a complicated technology. It's a technology developed in social psychology. Very nice technology, but and you should, actually, you can try it out. There's a website where you can try it out and figure out what your own biases are. It's slightly frightening. But nonetheless, you can figure out what the biases are. The other one is that you can give people identical speeches made by a woman and a man, and then see whether when the woman leader, invented leader who's giving this speech, gives the same speech, is she graded differently from a man? Both of these are very time consuming. And if you had to do this for the 500,000 people covered by a policy, you would never do it. Precisely because you know who was treated when, that you can do this. So when you do this, what do you learn? First thing you learn is men still hate the idea of women leaders, but they don't think they're worse as leaders. So you can actually do two different IITs, one to evaluate their reaction to whether the idea of a woman being a leader is acceptable to them, and the other to evaluate whether they actually think the women leaders are worse as leaders. They think women are fine as leaders, but they'd rather not have them. Now, as a consequence, and this is another fact which you can measure, when you look at when they've had a woman leader twice, the third time, they actually voluntarily vote for women leaders. So it turns out that, in fact, women leaders are much more likely to be elected where people have had exposure, and this provides a nice interpretation of that. Another, and I think distinct value of randomized evaluations is that it allows us to ask different questions. As I said, one advantage of randomized evaluations is that we control the treatment. The treatment is not a broad policy change which the government brought about for its own reasons, but something that we chose, or we meaning the organization implementing it chose. And if the organization wants to ask a sharp question, it can ask it. So if you think about how governments carry out reforms, they rarely carry out just one reform at a time. They put together a package. The package is teacher training plus textbooks plus different kinds of hiring policies. All of that's reformed, and this new reform is brought in place. Now you've changed 5 things. Now how do you know which of those, even if you can show that the package works, do you know that you need all of those changes? Do you think one of those changes is more important than the other? How do you answer that question? This is both a policy question and a research question. And one thing that we can So one thing that this, therefore the experimental methods allows us to do is just separate these components. It's just ask which of these work. Another thing we can do, which is related, which is that because we can because we are trying out ideas on an experimental basis, on a relatively limited scale, we can try out ideas that don't necessarily need to have a solid grounding. If you were the government implementing a policy, you wouldn't want to, and alas, this doesn't actually happen, but if you want to actually don't want to do something that sounds completely absurd. You want to make sense because you're rolling out policy. You're the government or you're an organization. This is going to last for 10 years. So you want to take responsibility. If I'm just doing an experiment, I'm an organization. I'm not a researcher, but I'm doing an organization. But I'm doing an experiment. I can feel much more comfortable saying, look, I'm going to try this out. If it doesn't work, we forget it. So you can try things which are very different, which you will not be able to try in a true policy context. So in other words, you start answering a different class of questions. What's an example of that? I'll take an example from, again, from Esther's work. This is work with Rachel and me. In this instance, everyone in the world, any policymaker you talk to, they all say immunization of children is a good thing. The one exception seems to be that the people who are supposed to immunize their children. If you look at rural Udaipur district, where we worked for many years, the full immunization rates we measured were around 4%. So 4% of children were fully immunized, 96% were not. And there were two theories that people were, so you ask everybody of course, including the government officials, all have theories of what's going on. And one theory is that the government immunization system has collapsed. And you hear this from the government as well. I mean, it's not just the private citizens. Government officials are often willing to blame the government, especially with somebody else's government. Or the second view, which is also very well grounded, and they say that there are people, these are traditional people, they have their traditions, they don't believe in immunization. You have to, so therefore they think they have their own belief system, and within that belief system, immunization doesn't make sense. Now, one of the things that made us think that the second theory is not entirely correct is that they seem to we noticed that it wasn't that they were never getting immunized. What happens is most people actually started the immunization process. They got one child given one immunization, but they didn't give them the second one. So we weren't entirely convinced that they had this deep belief system that was being offended. Nonetheless, we did this. We could do this experiment, which we would not have. No policy framework could have ever carried this out, where we asked the NGO to make the NGO arranged to make a commitment to deliver immunization on a fixed date. So one theory was that the government delivery mechanism has failed. You try to get an immunization, the nurse is never there, so you can't get immunized. So imagine I give you predictable delivery. What does that do? The second, and this was our theory, to be honest, of what will really work, reliable delivery. And then there was this other theory which we added on because it was cheap. This is the point of what I'm trying to make, which is that it's easy to do new variants. And what did we add on? We said, okay, if you get your child immunized, we'll give you 1 kilo of lentils, okay, dried beans. You get 1 kilo of dried beans every time you get your child immunized. Those were the two treatments. The second treatment, I think everybody, if we had proposed this in a policy context, everybody would have said, you're mad or something, or, do something serious. Dried beans, I think many people were very amused by the idea, but I don't think anybody took it seriously. So what do you find? When you do the camps to get people immunized, you raise the immunization rate. Full immunization rate goes from 4% to 15%, which is a big increase, and it does show that delivery is a problem. If you add the beans, you go from 15% to 45%. It's just massive, the effect. So you can increase your immunization. The combination of camps plus beans gets you from 4% to 45%. So it's clear that in some sense this is something that we would have never really tried it seriously except in an experimental setting. It's not the kind of thing you take, you know, you talk to a bureaucrat and say, well, start by trying to give away some dried beans. He will laugh at your face. So in some sense it was exactly the fact that it was an experimental setting that allowed us to do this. Similarly, and I don't want to take too much of your time, it's getting late, so let me just go quicker. What allows us to be innovative on one side also allows us to be nitpicky. We can ask finer questions. I already mentioned this. So if textbooks for teacher training appear to work, we can know whether it's teacher training or it's textbooks. We can separate them. So is it the case that these details of exactly how you run programs matter? Or is it the case that most standard options are equally effective? You know, there's some common sense, you just do it and it'll work. Or is it does it matter that I do it this way or that? Do the details matter? So here's a chart these are all just randomized evaluations, not even the complete list of these, this was actually a few years ago. We made a chart of the cost per extra year of education. So this is the cost from randomized evaluations of getting one more year of education for a child. So this is the cost for getting one child to get one more year of education. And there were different programs which had randomized evaluations, and we were comparing the costs of those things. And each of these is the scale on the left is all the stuff that's come from India and Kenya. Mexico is a richer country, so the scale is on the right. You can notice that starts at $1,000. In the Indian and Kenyan scale, it starts at 0. So if you look at these cost differences, let's look at Kenya. I mean, the cheapest intervention in terms of days added is deworming, which costs $3.25. You can't almost see it. And the most expensive intervention was girls' scholarships in one of the locations, and that cost more than $200. My point is only that, you know, in some sense, this is an arbitrarily selected group, but these are things, each of which you will find in a sort of a textbook version of, you know, what you're supposed to do to improve education. These are ideas that come up all the time in the conversation. They were all ideas that were given randomized evaluations precisely because they all had policy makers behind them. And if you look at the differences, you know, the differences are just of an order of magnitude. If you get the right one, you pay 5 or 10 or 200 times more. So if you get the wrong one, less if you get the wrong one. So, you know, the magnitudes here are massive. And in other words, it is not the case that what we have learned is that what we have learned in a sense, and this is somewhat frightening for people who, you know, don't particularly want to pay attention to detail, is that details matter. And details matter enormously. We can, if we get it wrong, we could spend, school meals cost $30 per year per child, and school uniforms cost $100. So that's 3 times as much. These are completely, if you ask any expert, they'll say that, well, you can try school meals or you can try your school uniforms. These are standard ideas around, but they are not equivalent. They're very different. And in that sense, this is both a statement of policy, but it's also a statement of research. We need to figure out a way to be able to say why one or some of these things are so different from others, and how can we think through what would predict what is more effective. So in some sense, the challenge to the research community has just gone up by an order of magnitude, because now it's not enough to say that education is wonderful. We have now to give some explanation for why certain interventions in education are so much more effective than others, and that changes the entire research landscape as well. So finally, and this one of the great advantages of a lot of these randomized experiments is that the the evaluation itself, for its validity of its estimates, doesn't rely on a lot of theory. The advantage of that, not necessarily for the interpretation of the results, but for the validity of the estimates, the fact that the estimate is a correct estimate of the program's effect, it doesn't rely on a lot of theory. Why do I say that's a good thing? Well, because it doesn't rely on a lot of theory, you can use it to test theory. Because if it already embodies theory, then it can't. There is a certain solipsism. You cannot test the theory that it is already built on. The estimation builds on a particular theory, you cannot test that theory. Therefore, the fact that it separates the theory and the estimation means I can test things which I could not have tested otherwise. So I can test theories. And in particular, we can vary the experimental options in ways that would never happen in the world and offer people options that they would never face. The kinds of experiments that Pascaline were describing, these experiments don't happen in the world. Nobody gives away BedNet, so you cannot know it. You can only create them under conditions which are, so in other words, theories are often tested in situations which are not actually real-world situations. They're often tested best in extreme situations. Extreme situations often don't happen in the world, but you can induce them in an experiment, and therefore you can test your theories better. So for both of those reasons, it's much more, it can be used to challenge even the most fundamental of our theories. So here's another paper that Esther and Michael Kramer and John Robinson carried out. They start with an experiment showing that in Western Kenya, fertilizer is very profitable. Rates of return are over 150% and very divisible. So it's not the case. The fertilizer is beauty of fertilizer. You can use it in a small plot, you can use it in a large plot. So you don't need to have a huge amount of money to buy the fertilizer. Even if you had a few dollars, you could use a little bit of fertilizer. Therefore, it's something that anyone can use. But only a quarter of the population uses it. It's very profitable. Everyone can use it. Why isn't it used? So the first thing they did was they did an experiment with a set of farmers. These 150% comes from that, where they gave the farmers the fertilizer. The fertilizer was used. The farmers saw the returns. So the returns, the demonstration was immediate. On their own plots, they did the farming. They had the fertilizer. They got these big returns. What did they do? Well, the next time there was a somewhat elevated level of, so next time they walked away and said, now you know that your fertilizer works, what will you do? Well, next time the usage levels are somewhat higher than the quarter that you usually get, but it's very quickly converges back to a quarter. So some reason people who actually experience the benefits of this still don't take it up. So we don't know why, but so then they found that and said, well, what's going on? So that was theory one. Theory one is that they didn't know. But if they didn't know, they saw it in front of their own eyes, they did it, now they must know. So that rejected theory one. When they ask them, they say, well, we don't have enough money. So maybe what happened was that we have savings problems. So, farming has a cycle. You get your crop in, say it's in April and you have to plant in June. And between April and June, you have to hold on to your money because you've harvested in April, you have got some money. Now you're going to plant in June. You sold your crop in April. Now you have to somehow wait till June. So how do you manage that transition? Well, they offered them a deal which says that, okay, if you buy fertilizer for harvest time, we'll deliver it at sowing time. So basic idea was that imagine that you can't save. You would like to save, but somehow, your relatives show up, you have to give them a good meal, your money just goes. So, by the time it comes around to planting time, you don't have any money left. So what they said is, at harvest time, you buy this fertilizer from us, and we'll deliver it to you at planting time. So that sort of solves their problem. So they were very enthusiastic, but curiously, they wanted delivery right away. So that seemed to have solved the problem, except for one puzzle, which is that they wanted to want delivery right away. So they don't want to say, bring my fertilizer later, they say, bring my fertilizer now. And moreover, when you give them the fertilizer, they don't actually take it to the shop and sell it. So if it is that your relative shows up and you have to feed your relative and you spend the money, then why don't you spend the fertilizer? You can go back and resell it. But somehow they don't do it. It doesn't happen. So what we end up with is that there's a new puzzle. So every experiment generates an answer which allows you to refine the experiment, which generates another answer, but then you can refine it again. And this dynamic process of learning, which is entirely unfamiliar to us in economics. It's, we learn from one fixed data set, whereas here we can go back, and this is what Pascaline was also, she was doing exactly this, which is go through a set of examples, start with theory 1, then refine the theory, keep trying, seeing where it goes, and you can converge to a much deeper understanding. You can keep refining your theories, and that's the last of the, I think, great benefits of the experimental approach. So I have taken more time than I intended or planned, but let me stop. So as you can see why there's so much excitement about the possibilities that have been opened up by experimentation, and I hope I've been able to convey to you some sense of why I at least am excited. Thank you very much.